Thursday, June 18th, 2020. Welcome, everyone. And I'd start with public comment. Kathy, have we received any public comment?
No, I have not received anything, Rich.
Any of the members, have you received any comment from our good public?
No.
Okay. All right. I do have a couple changes to the agenda. We have a presentation by the Department of Emergency Response. I'd like to push to the front. And I know our district attorney has some time commitments as well. So why don't we do the Department of Emergency Response presentation and then the district attorney, and we'll carry on from there, if that suits the rest of the committee.
That's fine.
Hearing no objection. All right. Brian, do you want to introduce?
Invited here to actually give our presentation is Hugh Bahar. He's a, I believe you're a PPE. Is that correct, Hugh, at Cornell?
Yeah, I'm a project manager at Cornell. I'm a degreed engineer from the State University of New York Maritime College. And I've been working at Cornell as an engineer and project manager since 1995.
Yep. None of which has anything to do with what we're doing right now.
Correct.
But we're here to introduce a project we've been working on for probably a little over a year now. So as you know, with our department and in particular dispatch, there's basically three components to being able to dispatch our public safety officers. One being obviously telephones, which if the telephones go down, we can switch them over actually to another county and get by. Another component is our records management system and CAD system. And we do have backup capability for that. The one thing we do not have backup capability for is our radio system. Now, as you know, we're going through a capital project right now to upgrade our microwave radio system. And that's actually going quite well, and it's probably going to be done ahead of schedule. But having said that, if something catastrophic happens to the radio system, we have no way of being able to send people out to emergency calls. So we've teamed up. It's kind of a public-private team approach to that. And Hugh is the local president of the RACES, or basically amateur radio folks who will be able to work with us to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Hugh, and let's leave it at that.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to attempt to share the screen here. Hopefully this will work. So give me just a moment.
That.
So folks, tell me if you can see the screen, please.
I do not.
Okay.
I do not either.
We will try one more time here. Hang on.
Yes.
I see it.
Okay. Does it say Tompkins County Department of Emergency Response on top?
Yep.
Yes.
Good. Wow, victory. Well, this is a different season here. A little snow on the ground at the department. So the Tompkins County Department of Emergency Response did ask the amateur radio, our local amateur radio association, to please start a RACES group. And you can see what RACES stands for, Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service. So the question is, well, what does RACES mean? It was founded right after World War II by the federal government, and is enacted by Part 97 of the Federal Communications Commission's rules. What it does is it allows local counties to tap the strength of civilian radio operators to come under the direction of the Department of Emergency Response, under Brian's direction, in emergencies where we may lose communication. And what we would end up doing is, I'll get into the more details in a moment, where we deploy to the fire stations and to the EOC. So not too long ago, 1991, FEMA, and we're in Region 2 of FEMA, which includes New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands, which is quite a lot of territory for one region. They provided more robust guidance as to how programs should operate, RACES programs should operate with their counties nationwide. And RACES has now come under the New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. So every Sunday morning at 9 a.m., I am on a statewide traffic net for the 5 regions of New York State, checking in to make sure that we have communications on high frequency. But there's much more to it than that. So that's the statewide response. But what we're providing for Brian is an instant ability to get people deployed to fire stations and use fire stations as the main point of communications for both police and fire and emergency services. And we'll have operators there at the stations and one at the EOC. So we have in New York State approximately 30 active RACES nets, meaning 30 counties out of the 62 or so counties in New York, however many there are, have an active RACES organization. And if I'm not mistaken, when you get within a certain distance of a nuclear power plant, like 9 Mile or one of the other power plants, RACES is hardwired into the emergency response program by state law, at least in New York State, if I'm not mistaken. We're not close enough here in Ithaca to make that a requirement, but other RACES organizations and counties are. So amateur radio in Tompkins County, when did it start? So it started in the 1950s. We have nearly 100 licensed members, and sometimes we pack the EOC where we meet monthly, or used to meet monthly until this disaster. We have approximately 100 members, and sometimes it's standing room only. I will say we have a very robust group of people. PhDs in RF engineering, former police detectives, former military, current and former firefighters, all kinds of professional folks, and many of whom are familiar with emergency response and emergency response communications. So we have participated also in Skywarn. For instance, I'm in touch all the time with Dave Nicosia down at the National Weather Service. So if we end up having a weather event coming in, we may give ground truth to Dave Nicosia down in Binghamton as well. But that's a part of the amateur radio piece, not really so much a part of the RACES piece. And as Brian alluded to, back in 2019, Brian recognized the real need to establish some backup communications. Even with the county 911 system, you can have disasters that lead to situations where the county 911 operators can't get signals in or out. It can happen. So RACES in Tompkins County, again, established in 2019. Off to the right here, you see the cover page of our, I think it's a 30 or 40 page plus document that's modeled off of other RACES organizations nationally. So Brian and I signed it. I am the radio officer for Tompkins County RACES, and Brian is the director of emergency response. And we have approximately 25 Tompkins County amateur radio folks who have submitted applications and have either undergone or are undergoing background checks by the sheriff's office, because we're eventually going to get an identification tag as volunteers for Tompkins County. So there isn't a problem if we have to man a radio at a hospital, if there's some sort of event like that where we have to deploy to places other than the fire stations or on top or in addition to the fire stations. We're also taking federal training. The National Incident Management System training is a well-known training program for incident managers throughout the United States. So there's going to be a good pedigree there. Background checks, National Incident Management Systems training, and of course, when activated, we report directly to Brian. So as I'll show you the RACES document at some point if you're interested in seeing the whole 30 or 40 pages. I can send that to you as well, but it's on a website. It's easy to get to. But goal number 3 of this, and goal number 1 was establish a RACES organization. Goal number 2 was to get people to join. And goal number 3 is, okay, what do we need to put in the fire stations and at the EOC? How are we going to communicate? And so goal 3, as written by Brian and his team, is determine the equipment needs needed to make this happen. So small radios, probably about the size, about this big and about that deep, and antennas. And that's really, those are the 2 key components to be put at key fire stations. And once we get them working really well, the goal is, and it's up to Brian, but the goal is probably to expand them to all the Tompkins County volunteer fire departments. So the equipment needs have been established for these 8 locations. And Brian identified 8 locations that we want to start with. And those are the EOC, of course, the Ithaca Fire Department, Tom Parsons, Cayuga Heights, Trumansburg, Newfield, Groton, Dryden, also known as Neptune, I believe, and Brooktondale. And like I mentioned, if Brian wants to expand those later on, we certainly will be able to do that. So the map I just pulled up here, let me just pause for a moment if there's any questions. Okay, moving on here. This map is our fire district map for the county. Looking at it closely here, there's 8 fire stations distributed sort of in a circle around the county. And then, of course, the Ithaca Fire Department, the 911 call center, and there's another one here. I can't remember which one that one was. That was maybe Cayuga Heights. Yeah, Cayuga Heights and Ithaca are pretty close here. Those are these 2 right in the middle. So the goal really was to get good distribution throughout the county so EMS and police could respond to these locations and keep in touch with the EOC. So next slide. So I'm going to introduce you a little bit to who the Tompkins County Amateur Radio Association is and what we do, and and a subset of this association of 100+ people. It says 60+. It's really 100+. About 60 people are regular members that show up. What we do and what makes us so fluent in radio communications and able to support Brian in this way. And the RACES members are a subset of our 100 Tompkins County members, our 25 RACES members. So we provide multi-mode, long-distance, tactical communications for the AIDS Ride for Life, which is, we have a net control down at Stewart Park, and we have folks as far away as the north end of Cayuga Lake, so up to 50 miles. We do this with our own gear for these events, for AIDS Ride for Life, Skunk Cabbage Classic, and Cayuga Lake Triathlon. We provide safety as required and requested by these organizations. We're very efficient at it, and we do it every single year except for this year. So you can see in the lower right-hand corner a typical meeting. I mean, it's a very active group. We have towers where there's towers up on Connecticut Hill where we have our repeater antennas, etc. So very active, very busy, very helpful for the county already. So we talked about RACES in the county a little bit and what Brian really wants it for, backup communications. And what about the rest of the country? There's a YouTube video where a town in Nevada one day lost all of their 911 communications. And you can see the insignia on the door here. That's either ARES or RACES. It's both, I think. Where what happened is the RACES folks deployed. They got on the equivalent of WHCU and told the community, 911's down. Here are the locations where there are radio amateurs that are in direct contact with the 911 operators and the sheriff's department, who can deploy fire, EMS, police if you need them. Come to these locations. That's where the amateur radio operators are, and they will tie into the sheriff's department. These things happen, and they happen more frequently than people would like to believe. As a matter of fact, in Montgomery County, very recently, New York, they lost cell service and landline service at the exact same time, just recently, within the last 2 months. So other stuff that they've done, this is another YouTube video. Charles Hargrove, after the World Trade Center collapsed, they had landlines and cell lines that were either damaged or overcrowded. And they activated RACES in that area and provided American Red Cross communications, because they had lost all their communications and were unable to be able to get out. So once again, folks who already owned equipment with communities and counties that had already helped to get them established and put them on top of antennas on top of buildings, they responded and did so very well to help the American Red Cross help our fellow New Yorkers. So there's a little blurb here on the left that's in quotes, and I'd like to read it just really quick. This was a former FEMA administrator. And he said, we get so sophisticated that we've gotten used to the reliability and resilience of our wireless and wired systems in our broadcast industry and all of our public safety communications that we can never fathom that they'll fail. They do, they have, they will. I think a strong amateur radio community needs to be plugged into these plans. So we are not there to provide primary communication. Primary communication is by the 911 call center and by the P25 system. We're there when that system fails. God forbid it does, and hopefully it won't, but we will drill. We've already done many drills, and we will continue to drill and work with the, begin to integrate ourselves into the 911 call center and the fire stations. So the rest of this paragraph or paragraphs is really just examples from Hurricane Maria to Katrina to the World Trade Center to hurricanes that move across the Bahamas, Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, again, part of FEMA District 2 in Puerto Rico and USVI, and how amateurs have really stepped in, especially RACES amateurs, to help get communications going until normal modes can be reestablished. So the next steps, and why we're here today, is there's going to be a purchase and installation of radio transceiver equipment and antennas at 7 fire stations and the EOC, making a total of 8. We are going to complete the background checks for the RACES volunteers. We've already done about 1/3 of them. I think we have about another, I don't know, 18 or so to go. Or no, not that many. Probably about another 12 or 13 to go. But anyway, completion of mandated NIMS training, the federal NIMS training by the RACES volunteers. We're going to be working with Brian's group to finalize our standard operating procedures and drill procedures, and then perform twice monthly tests and drills and integrate into the EOC. And anybody that's been by the EOC lately knows that it's been heavily manned during this COVID crisis. So that's been I was in there today, and it was very nice to see that the EOC was being quite well exercised and lived in over the past few months. And then Swift 911 is the notification capability that I think Brian is going to end up using to contact us if the need arises. We end up getting basically a cell phone text that says, please deploy, or anything else that Brian needs us to do, and we will reply and we will respond. So the question is, what does this radio look like? And this is an example. This is ICOM, which makes radios for the marine industry and the military. And it's a typical transceiver. And it has 3 different modes of communication. VHF, UHF, and UHF digital. It's a great rig. It can be put in fire trucks if the need be, or police cars. So it's a very portable rig and can be used as a base station, and it can also be used inside automobiles. So I guess with that, Brian asked me to keep it to 10 minutes, knowing that I can ramble. I hope I've done that sort of. And so I'd like to leave the last couple of minutes open for any questions that you might have.
Well, I would say that Brian had told me originally he had something exciting for us and some good news. And this is all of that. This is really, really comforting, and resilience is such an important thing. Certainly, I'm just waiting for us to get a severe weather event. We're pretty protected here, but not from that. And it's absolutely right. Our 911 system can go down. We've also done the AIDS ride for many years, and I've seen you guys out there. So thank you.
Absolute pleasure to serve the community, Richard. We love it. We really do.
Yeah, no, it's really good. Let me just see anybody. Anna.
Well, first, Rich, I wanted to make sure after this presentation that we can go to committee member reports. Is that okay?
Yeah, we're going to lose Matt Van Houten, so we wanted to hear from him.
Okay, I just want to make sure we get that in.
Yeah.
Hugh, thank you for this presentation. I'm curious, what is the cost that we're looking at for these systems?
Yeah, so I have asked Brian, we put together a proposal. We actually went out and got pricing, and the total cost for 8 facilities right now is $12,000 approximately. So that is not a shocking number, but when I proposed that to Brian, it seemed to be within Brian's budget. But go ahead, Brian, and elaborate if you'd like to, please.
Yeah, let me just explain. There's minimal equipment. What I feel is minimal equipment at the fire stations. And by the way, they've already done all the testing, so they know that it will work at those locations. But as far as like what you're looking at, radios and things of that nature, these folks own it. They have it already. We're not buying that. The only thing we're buying is the ability to get a signal from our 911 center to the various fire stations, and their folks will be there with their equipment to be able to receive it. It's just it's basically like antenna type stuff that would go on the fire stations themselves. And we have PSAP grant money that we can certainly use to accomplish this. So it's a fairly, or actually extremely cheap insurance for us to ensure that we have communications.
Okay. Anybody else with a question? Anna, did you have more?
No, I was just saying thank you.
Oh, okay. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you very much, Hugh. This is really informative and helpful and great. So good. Brian?
Absolutely, my pleasure. And thanks for having us today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to catch Brian, and I'll be happy to answer them, and offline if you want to, and elaborate and show folks around the equipment someday if they want to take a look at it.
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone. Take care.
Thanks, you.
All right. And I see that Heather has gotten on. Welcome, Heather.
Hi, thank you very much.
Okay. We have we're going to lose our district attorney, so we want to get his report.
Go ahead. I'm fine time-wise, but I appreciate
Okay.
it.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome, Matt. How are you?
Thanks, Rich. I'm good. I appreciate you moving me on the agenda. I will be brief. There's a lot going on in the world of public safety, and the mayor just announced today that he is putting together what he's calling Reinventing Public Safety, which is a commission that's going to look at policing and resource allocation in the law enforcement community. So I think he has named some of the people that will be stakeholders in that process, including the sheriff and the community police board of the city. I'm hopeful to be part of that process as well, but that's going to be a really meaningful and significant commission that's going to start, I think, very soon based upon recent events. And also in the state legislation, there's been a lot of state legislation that relates to police regulation, police misconduct, or regulation of the police. That there's been quite a few laws signed by the governor in the last few days, including requiring body camera for all the state police, taking a lot of measures to open up police personnel files to the public. So there's been a lot of action that's happened in the last few days relating to the community and public safety in the community. So there'll be a lot more to talk about, I think, next month. But as far as internally, we still don't have a grand jury. We're hopeful. We're told that we'll be able to talk about having a grand jury in phase 4, which, if we're going on the same timetable, will probably be starting in 2 weeks. The Office of Court Administration phase 4. We are phasing towards having more in-person court appearances, and having a grand jury is critical for us to move forward some of the serious cases that have been stockpiling over the last few months. So that's what I've got going on.
Questions for the district attorney? Martha?
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Matt. I'm just looking at an email from Jason. Maybe Jason was going to talk about this later, but about Derek and I are looking to take a countywide approach on police reform, a countywide approach to public engagement, feedback, and dialogue. And he said, later today, Mayor Myrick will be making an announcement addressing internal initiatives regarding IPD, and will also be committing to a countywide effort. I guess my question is, who's doing what?
Jason is going to talk to this, Martha.
Okay, so.
Well, I hope to be part of all those conversations.
Yeah, since Matt brought it up, I was wondering if now is the time to talk about it.
Well, Jason, I see you're with us. I thought Jason was with us. He's in a box. Okay.
That is an extensive conversation in and of itself, I feel like. I'm not sure Matt has the time for it.
Yeah, we're going to talk about this a lot. So Matt, you will obviously be involved in this going forward. I would note that when we were talking about priorities, one of the ones before COVID sort of knocked us off schedule on everything, we were talking about how well we had done on Minnesota. So it certainly looks like that will be a priority for us in all events. So it's coming.
Definitely.
Anna.
Well, I can hold off on most of my questions. I just will point out one thing that has been brought up to me a lot is our need to educate ourselves on language, and language that that Black and Brown communities prefer. And I've had a lot of people share using the word minority is maybe not the most equity focused. So I was thinking too, it might be good for us all to just have focus groups and really dig deep into our entire sort of infrastructure of how we think and talk and communicate. It would be great to bring someone in, Rich, who could do a training with legislators. I know that there are people in the community that would absolutely be willing to do that. So it's just a suggestion.
We certainly all have lots to learn. Henry,
Yes. Matt, do you expect all the courts to be open at phase 4, I assume?
Open in some capacity, reduced numbers, 25% capacity, trying to minimize in-person appearances through other kind of pushing out of court communications. We'll still be using virtual appearances as well. So it'll be a combination. We're not going back to the way it was at all, but there'll be more in-person court appearances.
okay. Anything else for our district attorney? Okay. All right,
Great.
thank you, Matt.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks, Matt.
Just moving through the agenda, minutes approval. We have minutes from May 21st, 2020. Could I get a motion to approve the minutes? Anna moves, Mike seconds. Thank you. Any questions or comments on the minutes? Okay. Can I make the rounds here? Let me just make sure I can see everybody. Mike,
Yes.
Henry,
Yes.
Anna,
Yep.
Glenn,
Yes.
and the chair votes yes. Okay. Chair's report. I did want to just indicate as chair of the Traffic Safety Committee, I'm called upon to approve the grant applications that the different county agencies put in. And there's a whole series of them. I think they were forwarded to the committee members. I would note one thing: if we could educate deer, we would reduce car accidents quite a bit. But there's some interesting initiatives to try to reduce accidents and to improve traffic flows and everything else. So that's going on. I think I will stop the chair's report because I see Jason is with us, and it makes sense just, I think, to talk about this commission that Matt brought up. So Jason, welcome.
Hi, everyone. How are you?
Good, Jason.
Yes.
Good.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I was out for a little bit, part of the first part of the meeting. I apologize. I had a phone call.
No, that's okay. Matt Van Houten just brought up the whole issue of the commission, and then your email came up that you'd sent out. So it sounds like there's some planning underway, particularly with the mayor. And maybe you wanted to just talk to that a little bit. And Executive Order 230.
Sure. I'm sorry. I don't know what commission Matt is referring to. Is he referring to just the executive order that's come out, or what the mayor is doing? I can speak of both of those. I can speak about the executive order and as well as my conversations with Mayor Merrick from earlier today.
Yeah, he was talking about the mayor.
Okay. Great. So as you know, executive order came out on Sunday following several comments by the governor earlier or late last week about police reform, reviewing policies, practices, so on and so forth. The executive order came out on Sunday. It's a fairly broad executive order that requires the chief executive of each jurisdiction that has a law enforcement agency in partnership with the law enforcement head, or in this case for us, it's the sheriff, to really develop a plan for police reform that has to involve community input, engagement, a public hearing, and then ultimately either a resolution or local law adopted by that jurisdiction by April 1 of next year. And the governor has attached, essentially the concept that he would withhold federal or state funding if that wasn't done by that date. That's really unclear as the details of that. Nonetheless, I think the purpose of this is to really take a strong look at police reform. I understand that today's press conference, the governor did talk about several questions that need to be answered as part of this process, and I would think that there will be more guidance coming from the second floor in the state as we go on in the next several weeks. So while we wait for that, I was able to talk with Derek earlier today and about how we proceed. And one of some of the thought we had was, is a lot of this effort is going to be, a lot of the police agencies or the communities that have law enforcement agencies are going to be going through a very similar process of public input, possibly surveying and different types of dialogue engagement. Why not have it be a countywide effort where we have those jurisdictions partnering in one collaborative effort? Mayor Merrick was very interested and supportive of that. He mentioned to me that they were going to start on a few initiatives internally, but very much wanted to be a part of a kind of a countywide coalition approach and wrap whatever work they're doing into a larger approach with other jurisdictions. Derek and I spoke about this as well, and we actually have a meeting set up, I think on Monday, to talk a little bit more about this on strategy. So right now, that's about as far as we have on that framework. I think following our meeting on Monday, also probably tomorrow, I'll set up a meeting with the chief executives of the jurisdictions that have police agencies, Groton, Dryden, Cayuga Heights, Trumansburg, and then the city, and then the 3 other higher ed institutions with their law enforcement agencies to talk about this strategy, put some framework in place, and then go from there and get their buy-in, and then go from there and start to develop a process that we can start with public input engagement, and see where that process leads us. It doesn't mean that there would be one plan submitted for everyone. It still means that the individual jurisdictions are going to have to submit individual plans, and those elected bodies will have to adopt those plans. But a lot, I think, of the initial discussion and dialogue can be done collectively. As you know, in our instance, and for the sheriff's office, there is no jurisdictional boundary. It's the entire county, and even then, almost all law enforcement agencies overlap in one way or another, whether it's a mutual aid or calling or responding to other calls. So that's where we are so far. The executive order does specifically identify prosecutors and public defenders as involvement in this process, and I just have not had a chance to connect with Matt or Lance on this yet. This is obviously very fast moving and fluid, and it's changing by the day. So it's something that we'll be steadfast working on over the course of the next few months. That's about all I have. Derek, I don't know if you want to add anything to it other than we're still trying to get our arms around how to approach it the best way, get the most info we can, and then move forward.
Yeah, I'll just add, Rich, I'm actually excited about this. I think it's going to be a good thing, and I think it'll give us an opportunity to highlight the good things we're doing, and also just to move forward and be even better. So I look forward to working with Jason and whoever else is going to be a part of it, and we'll get this done.
Sheriff, could you turn your volume up a little bit? I could hear you, but just barely.
Oh, okay. Do you need me to repeat myself?
Could everybody hear?
Yes, barely, but yeah.
Okay. No, you don't need to repeat yourself. Yeah, this will be quite a process, certainly.
Yeah.
Lots and lots to think about and do. This is good. Okay, Jason, anything further?
As of right now, no. I mean, that's a pretty big lift. And I think we'll have our work cut out for us, as is the community. It was good to get good reception. I did mention this today, and I sent a quick note out to the legislature earlier today, just prior to some of the mayor's public release of his initiative, just so you were aware that what conversations we had. I did speak to this on the elected official call today that we do every Thursday with elected officials. Got good feedback from those with police agencies, and got good feedback from those that don't, eager to participate in some form or fashion. So I think it's a good opportunity to show collaboration across the county. I can tell you just from my brief conversations with colleagues that I don't think it's being received as well or as collaboratively across the state as it is here. But we'll do what we do best. We'll get our community an opportunity to participate and engage and give guidance, and we'll be prepared. By April 1st, we'll have something completed.
Okay, several questions here. Anna.
Yeah, thank you, Rich. I wanted a few things. I think that it would be really good, given what you just said, Jason, how well it's being received I feel like we both have tremendous potential, particularly given how open and positive the sheriff is about this, and how much work the sheriff and undersheriff have done. We have an opportunity to really take the lead in the state in transitioning, but I feel that it's not going to be possible unless we also sort of do a deep evaluation of our philosophy and what it means to be an inclusive environment throughout the entire, our county government. So I'm curious, what your thoughts are. Because if it's just nipping around the edges and some small policies, it won't create the fundamental change that we're looking for. And there are opportunities. For example, we have built connections with the Vera Institute, and they have they're amazing resource. They have really appreciated the focus that we've had on alternatives to incarceration, for example. And how do we expand that? One of the things that has been asked for is, defund the police. And I think that it would be really good for us to evaluate what that really means. Because the more I study it, and I've talked to the sheriff a bit about it, and I've talked to the city as well, there is, a message in that of what are your priorities. And there has been some really interesting literature about how to support law enforcement, because over the last couple decades, so much has been dumped onto the table of law enforcement without the training, without necessarily sufficient funding. And it would be really good for us to dig deep on, where could case management, where could community programs really support law enforcement and be more collaborative. So I feel like, I would really like to see this be a central priority so that we can, because we have the potential here, because we have the community support, we can be really cutting edge in what we do. So I just felt like that needed to be said.
All right, Martha?
Thank you, Rich. Yeah, Jason, Matt mentioned before he left, that Savante was starting a commission. My question was just, I hope we're not having two commissions. I'm looking now at the Ithaca Voice article, and that seems to be identified really towards IPD and, really digging into the city's department. So I guess as long as there's not duplication, but kind of, both this makes a whole lot of sense. And it just seems like the county there's overlap, but it seems like coordination is really important here.
Yeah, I will say, and the Ithaca Voice article doesn't include the statement that he released, the press release, and then the press release there was a specific mention that that's basically what you just said, that's some internal focus on their part, but that they're eager to be part of a countywide coalition as we go through this process. So that was really part of the conversation I had with him, is that a lot of times we find ourselves in a situation where the county and the city particularly are doing things, and many times we're pulling a lot of times from the same community members to provide input. We dealt with this on kind of the green initiatives, where each entity is creating its own committee or task force, and then you find yourself asking the same people to serve on the same task force. And I think a lot of these questions are going to where we're an agency that oversees and really has jurisdiction over the whole county. It just made a lot of sense to have at least portions of this being collaborative efforts. And there are nuances that will be specific to communities and departments, because where the sheriff's office is and maybe where the city PD is maybe in a different place where the smaller departments are. But nonetheless, the dialogue itself in many areas, I think, is the same dialogue. So why not do it collaboratively? And I got, so far, I think there's been a good positive response to that. So with an eye on, you could have, you have 8 law enforcement agencies doing the same process 8 times, or you could have them collaboratively working on as many of those areas as possible. And I think that's what we're striving for.
So that sounds great. It's really important to do that. For one thing, we, often I will get comments about that thing that IPD did and why didn't the county do something about it? It's like, well, that's not us. So so was there clarity from the governor's office that the higher education entities are involved? That last I heard was unclear.
I haven't. Derek and I spoke today, and he was going to reach out to those law enforcement heads over there to see if they apply to it, and whether or not it's applicable to them or not. I think we would still invite them to be part of the conversation if they wanted to participate. I think we're still getting clarity on it. I would imagine they would be. I mean, when you think about it, all of those agencies do respond out in the community, and they are part of the community. It's not as if they're isolated there. So we'll get some clarity. It's in the works to try to figure out where they lay in all this. But we'll invite them to the conversation, and again, hopefully they'll participate.
All right. I just hope the state police is doing the same thing. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. Ann?
Thank you. So I just wanted to say, since it's been, I think, almost 4 weeks since George Floyd was killed, I really appreciate you guys bringing up this important topic, and especially talking about collaborating between the different public safety departments. I know as far as COVID, there's been some, I'll call it inconsistency. I don't know if it's the right word. You get to, each department, each public safety department gets to decide what they're going to do. But I'm hoping this can help, not just with make this topic better, the racial injustice, but also issues around COVID, being more consistent about the message we're giving to the public, and also anything else that comes up. So I'm hopeful that this will be a change for the better. And also, when we look at alternatives to incarceration, those things can probably be better administered and better, more effective if all the departments are working together. So thank you very much for everybody who's working on this. And since I have the airtime, I'll just say thank you for the Sheriff's Department for the initiatives you've already undertaken. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ann. Henry?
Yes, Jason, I initially read about that how other counties dealt with this, and they were saying that they consider this an unfunded mandate. Is that what you're hearing from the other administrators? And also, is there any funding that will come along with this?
So, I'll be very candid. This has received mixed reviews from my colleagues across the state of New York. And some of them feel it's an unfunded mandate. Some of them feel it's unconstitutional to tie or withhold funding through an executive order tied to an initiative like this, which it probably is, to be candid. But I don't think that's the point that at least we're not focusing on. I mean, we're focusing on this being an initiative that will hopefully begin to bring cultural change in an area that we have made progress on, probably much more than most areas, but we'll continue to make progress on. So a lot of them, I think, are bent out of shape about the fact that the governor is trying to tie federal and state aid funding to it. I also think a lot of them are not good and don't have these types of conversations about race in their community and don't want to. And that's a very difficult thing to accept. So, this is going to be a difficult series of conversations. It'll be uncomfortable. And it's a process that you have to go through to start to talk about reform and change. And a lot of folks, personally, from my personal opinion, talking with some of those folks, they don't want to do that. So it's an unfunded mandate. Sure, I guess it is an unfunded mandate. I mean, let's be honest, we have a global pandemic. We have probably the worst generational budget problem any of us have ever faced. We're talking about making significant reforms around inequities and anti-racist practices that we don't yet see or that we're going to identify. These are pretty serious issues to address all at once. So to say that we're overwhelmed would be an understatement.
Okay. Anna?
Yeah, I just want to note too, I think that, I've spoken to Derek some. There was an email that went out that Deborah Dawson sent out, which I really appreciated, which listed a whole bunch of policies that the NAACP was pushing for policies for law enforcement. And Derek, if I recall, your response was, we've already instituted every single one of those. You also have all of them online. You even have complaint forms online and policy recommendation form online. I think it's really important that people know that those first steps, I mean, granted, we all know those are just first steps, or we wouldn't have, 25% of our jail being Black and brown, members of our community, even though they only represent 4% and 4% in, 4% Black and 4% Latinx community. We know that, we're working on it, but I think it's really important that we also outline all the steps that have been taken so that we can figure out, how to integrate them, what they mean, how to evaluate them, what impact that they're having. So I think we're not starting from ground zero.
Okay. Yeah, certainly more to come there. I would note that the governor seems to be derogating some policymaking power to the county administrator. But Jason and I have talked about that. Obviously, he's committed to working with us on this. And if we can make progress, I'm not sure it really matters how it happens. So certainly more to come there. Moving on, though, we have Heather Campbell with us, and I'd like to put off the discussion of the Labella report so we could hear from Heather, if that's okay with the committee. So let's move on. Heather, welcome. Thank you for spending some time with us. And
Thank you.
for being there.
That's okay.
It's really good to have you with us. And by the way, I heard you come and give your presentation to the CJATI committee on orders of protection. And if you could touch on that as well, if you have a little bit of time on that, I think it would help the committee to hear what you have to say there too.
Sure.
Not to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. I'm going to I prepared a few slides. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay. And can people see?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the impacts of COVID-19 on victim services, and we are seeing some trends, particularly in the last couple of weeks. Excuse me. That I want to be able to report on. And so let me start out by saying that we have definitely seen, let me get rid of this. Oh my goodness, okay. There we go. We've definitely seen an impact, probably not surprisingly. Obviously, there are dynamics of domestic violence that have thrived in the isolation. And so the social distancing and isolation has given offenders opportunity and access to increase their abuse. People are spending more time in their household, potentially with an unsafe person. There's limited privacy. Financial constraints, unemployment or financial stresses don't cause domestic or sexual violence, but they do tend to make those things worse and more dangerous if they're already present in the relationship or household. We're also knowing that kids are having less contact with other adults, less contact with mandated reporters. And so calls to the New York State Child Abuse Hotline declined sharply in Tompkins County and across the state. So there were just less disclosures of child sexual abuse because children were not being seen by other adults other safe adults who they might normally report to. There's also was a concern in the community that people had that services weren't available during the pandemic. There were some rumors that shelters were closed. And there were also concerns from victims that accessing services would increase the risk of becoming infected with the virus. And there was actually some research that was just released last week that was done downstate, where they actually surveyed victims of domestic violence who had sought shelter and found that had delayed, that both the isolation of living with an abusive partner and the concerns about coming into shelter and accessing services would be unsafe during the pandemic delayed people reaching out for support. And we've definitely seen those patterns in our community as well. During the pandemic, we really quickly moved to a remote model. So outside of our shelter and some limited services like child interviews with law enforcement and child protective services and some law enforcement interactions, we moved to an almost completely remote model. up until the last week. Our domestic violence shelter did remain open throughout the crisis. We did limit the occupancy of our house. We are now, right now, not taking more than 7 people or 4 family groups, so 4 separate family groups into our shelter at any time, which could mean we could have fewer than 7 people. Our shelter has congregate living. People have their own bedrooms. We're not doubling people up right now, unrelated people. So that limits our, depending on the configuration, that limits our number of people we can take in. But we have a shared kitchens and bathrooms, and we feel like we could not, people could not be socially distant with more than 3 to 4 family groups in the shelter. So we have lowered the number of beds, but we've been able to keep our shelter open throughout this, which I will be very honest, I was not in March, I was not prepared to run a shelter during a pandemic. We had a really steep learning curve in terms of how do we keep our shelter safe and healthy during this time. We did move to remote services, and we have been providing services through safer text, safer video, and phone models. We have some specific security concerns related to communication. Our confidentiality rules are actually more strict than HIPAA. And so this was something we had to, and we have to really, really consider that some survivors are not going to be able to safely use communication methods to reach out to us if they're living with an unsafe person. So we've had to get really creative, but we also have just not heard from people. People have reached out to us and then dropped out of contact, and we're not sure if that's by choice or because they just haven't been able to reach out to us again because of lack of privacy. Our legal advocacy services became really important as the courts shut down for emergency filings only. Some of you may know that about 18 months ago, we were able to hire an attorney for the first time. So we have an in-house civil legal services program. And this, I can't even express to you how critical this was during the pandemic, because within 2 days, we were able to have emergency filings happening. So emergency order protection filings. And for programs that did not have internal legal services, program like ours that did not have internal legal services, and some of those communities, it took 1 to 2 weeks to get remote order of protection filing up and running. So we feel really grateful for having those resources. We also feel really grateful Tompkins County had been identified, it was either last year or the year before, as a pilot location for remote filing. So we had some of the infrastructure in place already. We have seen an increased order protection filing in the last few weeks, which is not surprising, but we have done multiple orders of protection a week throughout the pandemic. And I will say, just like everything else, everything takes longer during this crisis. And so a remote filing takes hours of staff time of helping people through their paperwork, working with the court clerks, working on service issues. So it's been a really time-intensive process. There's also been a lot of very complicated, as you might imagine, custody and visitation issues, and offenders using the pandemic and the concerns about COVID as a ways to manipulate custody. And so we've been working with the courts on a lot of emergency custody issues as well. We've been doing a lot of individual safety planning with survivors, and also working and partnering with Hugo Medical Center. We have still continued to provide sexual assault exams throughout this. In fact, one week we had 4 exams, which is actually a lot for our community. And so exams have continued to happen. We have set up telehealth communication with the hospital. So we are currently, based on CMC's advice, we are not sending advocates to the hospital. I have to be honest, I'm not sure when exactly we're going to feel comfortable doing that, but we're staying in contact with CMC, but we've been able to effectively provide telehealth services throughout this the entire time. Our education services also flipped very quickly. We spent, especially the first couple of months, we did a huge number, our educators did a huge number of consultations. We saw a huge spike in calls from people we would consider bystanders. So neighbors who were home and were hearing abuse or had concerns about adults or children who lived around them. We got a lot of calls in the first few months from employers or supervisors who were hearing or seeing things during Zoom calls or had concerns about a employee and didn't know what to do. So we spent a lot of time consulting, and then we did did a lot of consulting with youth workers, schools, and other people who were concerned about children and youth who may, again, have been sheltering in place with people who are less safe for them and who may have been cut off from support. So we spent a lot of resources also making sure that the other youth serving agencies, that we were all connected and communicating well together. We also continue doing programs. Our staff have been doing remote programs for colleges, for high school health classes, for middle school health classes, as well as professional trainings, as well as trainings helping people identify the needs that the specific needs that survivors may have during the pandemic. Well, we also did a lot of social media outreach to let people know. We did a social media campaign to let people know services were out and available. The county actually did a really great job helping us signal boost that. We really appreciated that. Also, local law enforcement did, and we saw the impact of that. And we also did some emergency outreach on some very specific issues. For example, when the mutual aid groups online were starting to organize, we immediately started getting reports of people trying to exploit people who were asking for help. So people basically, somebody would put out an offer for help and people would pose as helpers and then be abusive or expect sexual favors or sexual photos in exchange for that assistance. So we quickly worked with mutual aid groups, got out information in the community about receiving help safely during a crisis. And we're still continuing that work. Trends that we are seeing in services. In March and April, our hotline call volume was pretty typical. It was about 3% higher than those months in 2019. However, we saw the percentage distribution of our calls really change. There was a decrease in March and April in calls around youth physical abuse and child sexual abuse, and there was a significant increase of calls, the percentage of calls that were about domestic violence, which was what in some ways what we expected. However, in May, we had been really preparing. We had heard from communities that were slightly ahead of us in the pandemic response that what they saw is when things started to ease a little bit, that there was a sharp increase in need from victims of sexual and domestic violence. And we think that we are seeing that now, because in May, our hotline volume went up almost 30% over the previous year. I mean, we've really just seen a huge increase, and 100% of that increase in May was from adults who were calling about domestic violence or adult sexual assault. And we saw something like a 22 or 23% increase in calls about adult sexual assault. And that's really significant because we have many fewer college students in town right now. And unfortunately, the pattern that we most often see as May is that we get a larger number of calls about sexual assault or rape that are from college students. There's a lot of parties, there's connections between alcohol and risk. But none of these were college cases. These were all adult community members. And so that was a significant increase in those calls as well. Our overall numbers of ongoing clients are down for the last few months, which again, these patterns that we're seeing are being seen all over New York State. Survivors have dropped out of contact, which is not surprising. People have had a lot of stressors going on. Some people may have been sheltering in place with people who are unsafe to them. In the last couple of weeks, these folks have started to come back and reach back out again. So we're really glad for that. We have seen an increase in child sexual abuse disclosures in the last few weeks. We've seen an increase in child interviews that we've been involved in. My understanding from local DSS is that they've started to see an increase in the number of calls that are also going to the New York State hotline. So we're seeing some normalizing of the percentage of calls that we would expect to get. Our shelter occupancy is still low. As I said, we did reduce beds in the shelter. We're getting many calls for shelter, but we're seeing few survivors actually come in. And a lot of this we think is just people are still really worried about coming into congregate living, which is a real risk. And we are really honest to people about, here are the things we've done to reduce the risk, and we've done a lot in our house to reduce the risk and make it safer. And here are the risks, but this may be picking up as well. We've had 3 shelterings this week. We have also heard from communities that there's been a tremendous increase in need for shelter when things start to loosen. So we have been talking with community partners and also some local foundations to be prepared if we do see our shelter overwhelmed, because I am concerned about that. I'm concerned about the need for shelter overwhelming our beds. And so we have a plan in place for that right now. Things we're concerned about and things we're paying attention to. I mean, we are making slow, careful steps towards a more normal service model. We started increasing very slowly and carefully the number of in-person services we're providing. That's starting this week. It will be increased in a couple of weeks as long as everything locally stays, you know, the curve stays flat like it is. But it's really unclear what the new normal will be. And of course, this is what we're all struggling with, is what this sort of new normal will be. And so we're really planning right now that we're going to be existing in this kind of hybrid model of virtual services and in-person services for some time. We are concerned about the cumulative impact of funding cuts next year at a time when we really need to have the capacity, when there's a lot of need. We're definitely paying attention a lot to decrease fundraising at a time when we need increased capacity. We had to cancel our largest fundraiser for the year. We're flipping it to a virtual event later this year, but generally about $20,000 of income from that event. So about half of that money comes from local businesses, most of whom have not been open in the last 3 months. So we're expecting that, you know, many of those businesses, you know, may not be able to fulfill the commitments they made. And we're, you know, talking with folks about that. But we're just watching what the impact will be, and we're trying to be as creative as possible, but that's going to have an impact this year. New York State pays shelters based on a per diem, so we get paid for only if beds are filled. And for shelters across the state, we've lowered our capacity, and then we've also seen fewer people coming in because of the pandemic. New York State's aware of this problem and aware that shelters are facing a deficit. This is a known flaw in the New York State shelter funding system. New York State has known this for over 10 years. This is not how most states fund their domestic violence programs. And we don't get any core funding for shelter. We only get paid by per diems. So New York State says they're working on this, but we haven't gotten any definitive information. There was Family Violence Prevention Services Act money in CARES Act funds. New York State is making decisions right now about how to use those funds, and we're working with our state partners on that. And this is related to the New York State Domestic Violence Governors Task Force, which I think it was Anna may have sent an email about. And I can talk about that more in detail if people want more information. But the governor pulled together a blue ribbon panel. I've been involved for the last 2 years in a governor's planning process that this is related to, and they've come out with recommendations. And what New York State now appears to be doing is instead of directing the CARES Act funds that were set aside for family violence programs directly to programs for core support, they're going to be putting those funds into some very specific targeted programs, many of which I agree with and support, but it sounds like those funds aren't going to be used to just meet some of the core funding deficits that programs may be facing. So we're paying a lot of attention to that. We're obviously paying a lot of attention to the community conversations about racism and policing, and we are doing internal conversations in our agency and have been, and thinking about what are the ways we respond using the criminal justice system to domestic and sexual violence, and also looking at other models of community intervention and accountability. And these are conversations that are obviously happening across the nation, and so we're a part of that as well. And we're obviously really interested in being at the table when we're talking about community policing, as it obviously impacts the people that we're serving. And we're also really paying a lot of attention to what is happening with youth safety engagement over the summer. We are really concerned that we are at a time when youth are going to have less options, less engagement, less employment, less programs, that we're worried that also connects to safety, that it also connects to youth being developing relationships with safe, healthy adults. So we're, reaching out to other youth agencies and trying to really think creatively about that. But we're really concerned about that. I'm really concerned about younger kids that don't have summer camp options and may be in less safe or less ideal situations. I'm really concerned about under-supervised and under-engaged teens. And, as I know a lot of other people are as well. I think the loss of GIAC and the Youth Bureau obviously is a huge loss, to the community right now. So we're trying to be as creative and think about what resources we can bring to the table. That's a really quick overview of what we're seeing, the patterns, what we're concerned about. There were a lot of things I could have told you. Are there things you want to know more about or have questions about?
Yeah, Heather, thank you. That was a very efficient review. There's a lot to unpack there. And I'm sure there'll be questions, but I did want to give the sheriff and undersheriff a chance just to comment as well, because I know they've been involved in collaborating with your agency.
Mhm.
Sheriff? Jen?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. No, I'll just add quickly that, we did create a new domestic violence response policy that Heather was involved in her agency. They reviewed it, made recommendations, we made some changes, and it's always been a pleasure working with her agency for many, many years. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
The training last year.
Yeah.
Yeah, Heather, I would like to get your thoughts on bail reform and orders of protection, but why don't we talk about this first? I do see,
Sure.
Anna, you had a question?
Yeah, quick question. I wish we could have like a 2-hour session with you and get this, because I know I could hear all the pieces that you had to leave out, and I'm thirsty to hear all of it. So maybe we can talk at some other time.
Absolutely, I'd love to.
But you mentioned at the end about the lack of opportunity outside of the home, and I'm wondering if you are working right now. I mean, it's small; it's like a drop in the bucket. But the TC Workers Center workforce. They have the internship program, and I know they have another 40 to 50 slots open.
Yeah.
And making sure that it'd be ideal if that could be filled with people who youth that are at risk.
Yeah, I think they're like the game in town right now, right?
Yeah,
Like
the only one.
Yeah, like they're really.
Wow.
So we're definitely aware of that. I've been trying to get a hold of folks. I know they're so stretched at GAC to even say like, is there anything creative we can extend our resources, in our umbrella. And to try to think about, are there any small programs that we could potentially, they've got a teen group that really has a lot of prevention elements in it. Could we potentially, is there anything creative we can do? So we're really trying to think creatively, but yeah, I mean, I will say it has also been a real challenge to stay connected with our teen and young clients virtually. There's definitely the digital divide issues of people not having, access to phones or internet, or phones run out of minutes. I mean, there's all of those issues. We also tend to meet with a lot of teens in school and young people in school. Is that our staff will actually go during their free periods or during lunch and meet with them there. It's a really stable period. It's also a time that we don't have to depend on family members for coordination, which sometimes can be challenging. Right. So so even some, right now I know our youth staff, have continued to try to stay connected, and but there are real challenges even getting connected to some of our, our young clients right now.
Thanks for that. And only one other question. Can we get your slides?
Yeah, totally. I can definitely.
Thank you.
All right, Martha.
Thanks, Heather. I don't know how you sleep at night.
Yeah, well, there have been some days during this that has not been a lot of sleep, I will say.
No,
also homeschooling a 6-year-old, just on the side.
Yep. No, I really appreciate this, and it's so thoughtful and so sensitive. The question of your shelter, it occurred to me that could there be surge space or whatever with one of the hotels? I mean, we had, I'm not familiar with any of the details, but I believe we set up an arrangement if somebody needed quarantine, they couldn't stay in their home if they were positive for COVID, that there are ways to have accommodations. So I don't know if there's some work we can put together there.
Yeah, so we actually have a plan in place for increasing shelter overflow. I will say we actually don't talk about it publicly because of the confidentiality and security concerns. So I definitely appreciate the idea that part of it actually we have covered. We have a plan for overflow if we get overwhelmed. And we've talked to a couple of local foundations if we need, for the COVID, in terms of COVID relief funds, if we need extra funds to make that work. So we do have a plan in place for that. Yeah, we started planning as soon as we started hearing from other communities that they were seeing a surge. We started planning for that.
So I would really encourage that the message go out that people don't have to share bathrooms or kitchens. I would agree. That's a really tough choice anybody should have to make.
It is. Yeah, and I feel really grateful. I felt grateful through this for sort of privilege of place for our community, where we are, the resources we have, how people have coordinated. In March and April, I would be on state calls with other domestic violence programs. We were meeting several times a week, and there were programs downstate where almost half of their staff in their shelter tested positive for COVID, and and clients, staff were volunteering to quarantine in place with in wings of shelters with clients who were also positive. I mean, it was a really intense situation downstate. And we planned for the worst, and luckily did not need to put most of our contingency plans in place. But it was a pretty intense there for a few weeks. And so we feel really grateful that most of our contingency plans did not. I mean, there was a plan. If we had started to have a higher number of cases locally, we would have had to close the shelter and make other arrangements. But luckily we did not get to that point.
Thank you so much.
Again, maybe you could just talk for a few minutes about the impact of bail reform on orders of protection.
Yeah, gosh, that feels so far away. It doesn't.
It does. It really does.
Things are from January seem like a million years ago.
But it's still an issue. Yeah.
It's still an issue. So, so let me sort of center my brain on this. So, one of the things we were really paying a lot of attention to, and I will say, this connects to, I think, what you were talking about earlier. I mean, some of the impacts of, sort of bail reform and the criminal justice reforms, we had already made a lot of changes, in our county. And so it was a less abrupt change, although there was, definitely pieces that relate to prosecution and discovery and the impact that has on cases, and the impact on orders of protection. And so our concern was and continues to be that because with bail reform and the changes in particular to discovery rules, that there are cases where there is serious abuse, where there may be a delay in arrest, and that there may be a delay in arrest because of those procedural things. And there could be cases where victims don't have orders of protection in place as quickly as they would have, and they could be left unprotected. And they potentially could be left unprotected during a time when the offender knows they have talked to law enforcement, which may be a particularly dangerous time. So what we're working on before the pandemic was making sure that all local law enforcement were aware that in many of these cases where there was interpersonal violence, whether it was sex abuse or domestic violence, that victims could have the option of getting an order through civil court, through family court, and knowing how to make that happen quickly. So making sure that frontline officers knew that if an arrest wasn't happening right away for some reason, that they could make the referral to family court, and how to make that happen really effectively to make sure that they were knowing that an advocate could be called. Now, when somebody shows up and the clerk's office shows up now virtually, or it used to be in person, for an order of protection, we get called and we walk people through that process. But it takes time. And so we want to make sure that happens as quickly as possible. There's also always been a mechanism in place where magistrates could act as a family court judge and could issue an emergency order of protection after hours. Because the problem with family court orders is that they're only available, of course, during business hours generally. That provision has been not being used in our county very often. And part of that reason is our county had generally, not always, but historically been pretty good at moving forward on arrests and cases, and also having arraignments happen right away. And judges would generally issue orders of protection at that arraignment. It doesn't happen as smoothly in other counties, but that process generally happened more smoothly. So right before the pandemic hit, we were working with the county and the Magistrates Association to make sure that judges knew what that procedure would be, and that also law enforcement knew how to trigger that process. And that is, of course, all got interrupted with the pandemic. So that's, that's a really nuts and bolts concern that we had about how orders of protection could be interrupted or delayed, and that could have real safety implications for victims.
Rich, could I jump in for just a moment?
Absolutely, Lance. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, my mic, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, it's my mic plays games. I agree with Heather on a couple points. I think they are moving forward on the family court and magistrates and getting that service. I know Judge Raleigh's invested in that, trying to make it happen. I think just to update you, particularly I think the Sheriff's Department has historically been good about this. In this county, we are active because of the after hours arraignment processes. There's usually not an issue with a delay with criminal orders of protection. And that's continued during the pandemic for the most part, as far as I'm aware, because we do after hours arraignments on those orders of protection. Even with the bail reform, that's one of the exemptions. So we're still pretty good here with the criminal orders. I mean, as Heather noted, we're better than most counties, I think.
I agree.
Other counties have issues, but I just wanted to update. I think pandemic wise, we haven't dropped off there yet. I know IPD and the Sheriff's Department have been pretty active if they have an OP issue of getting the after hours arraignments going on virtually. I can attest to that because I've been called a few times. And have spent hours with deputies.
Sorry, I will say the Sheriff's Department has historically been really cooperative with serving orders of protection, which we've always been grateful for. Again, that kind of cooperation doesn't always exist, and so we're really grateful to that. I think that we're talking about a smaller. I think the system is working in most cases, in particular misdemeanor level cases. I think the places where we have had cases where there's been delays in arrest have been cases with more. And my electricity is flickering. And so if I disappear, that's why. Is where cases where we've had some serious felonies, and they have, because of some of the bail reform issues and regulations and discovery issues, they may have delayed an arrest for procedural reasons or reasons related to the investigation. And those are the cases where we've had that gap. So yeah, so we're just staying on top of it.
Yeah, and let me just comment because I'm aware of what Heather's saying, but let me just be clear from my perspective. The changes in its discovery, I think she's really talking about, doesn't preclude an immediate arrest. I mean, there may be procedures people have made about how they want to pursue that, and I don't think that's Derek's policy, but you can still have and should have, in my view, if you have a serious domestic violence issue, a felony level sexual abuse case or DV case, there should be an immediate arrest. And I think it allows for that. I know I have a difference of opinion than other people, but that may be more of a procedural issue we need to develop on that. And I know, I suspect Derek is because we have him sitting there. I don't want people to think that he's an issue there. Their office is, I think, ready to arrest as soon as they can on that. But I just wanted to keep people aware of that. It's more of an implementation issue, I think we have.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Does anybody have any questions or comments on the bail reform order of protection discovery issue? Just informational then. Okay, Heather, thank you so much for coming and talking with us.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, this is really good. And as we move towards reopening, I'm hopeful that things will sort of get better.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
I hope so. Thank you very much.
Okay. Let's keep going. I think next up is Department of Probation and Community Justice. Dan Cornell, welcome.
Hello, everybody. How are we? Getting rained on here and pretty hard downtown now. So everything's going smoothly here. We're starting to see some increase in work from the court, nothing drastic yet. Tomorrow will be the end of the furlough for all the people in my probation officer titles. So I have 6 people coming back. Unfortunately, 5 others had to ask for an extension of the furlough based upon childcare needs and lack of a plan where people usually send their kids to camp or other things. And I've got 2 others who have taken some FMLA. So we're still going to be slightly short-handed, but I think we'll be okay. Those extended furloughs are for partial weeks. So I'm still going to have everybody coming in here around at least 20 hours a week for the furloughed folks. But others will be back full time. Problem we're running into is it's been an extended period of time with no other real services in the community, as far as no domestic violence groups, no sex offender treatment groups, very little in the way of substance abuse counseling. We just got guidance from Office of Probation and Correctional Alternatives that they don't want probation departments doing urine testing due to risks for COVID-19. We have been doing drug testing throughout the COVID crisis, using universal precautions. I don't see a reason to discontinue doing drug testing. I'll consult with Frank Krupa on if the risks are any higher than they would be for contracting anything else. And we are able to social distance in the collecting room and things like that. And I think it's been, the drug testing has been a key piece in helping a lot of our people maintain sobriety and staying on track. So,
Was that guidance or a directive?
it was guidance, but I still want to speak with Frank if there's any risk that I'm missing, because I don't want to put any of our employees at undue risk of harm. But, you know, again, with universal precautions, everybody wearing masks, gloves, face shields, all that. I really don't see how we're at any higher risk of contracting COVID than we would be just through our normal processes. But I will speak with Mr. Krupa about that. The state aid plan, they requested our state aid plan to be done during the COVID crisis. We don't usually receive the application until the end of June, but they gave it to us at the end of April and wanted it at the beginning of June. So we've completed and submitted that. We're working on the budget here. That is essentially finalized with one need to contact DSS just to confirm that their budget's gonna allow them to fund a couple of our people that they normally pay for family court. And I think we're in good shape. Definitely happy to be getting people back. And sounds like, again, we're in the state, there's probably a third to a half of probation departments that still have not had a person working in their office since March. So we're ahead of the curve. We're following our reconstitution of operations plan, trying to make sure that we're staying as safe and keeping conditions, you know, sanitized, and trying to keep ourselves and the people that we serve from getting sick. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dan. I'm curious, is part of your reopening plan day reporting? And are you figuring out a way to make that work?
We started talking about that 2 weeks ago. I think it may still be a little premature, but the idea being we've never really gotten to a point where we had to call the courts and say, we're too full, we can't take any more people. But I think now we're in a position with social distancing that we're going to have to determine the number of people that we can safely serve and maintain our spaces. As far as programming, most of the people that we contract with have not reopened yet, that being our BOCES task GED teacher, Cornell Cooperative Extension. They're, to the best of my knowledge, they're still out. At least they're not beating down the door trying to get back in here to work. So we do have contingencies where we can provide the programming ourselves, but it relies a little heavier on our staff to do that with their other responsibilities as well. But I think we could handle, you know, the estimate, you know, somewhere between 5 and 8 people at a time with the 2 classrooms and the other areas that we have. It is a pretty big space. But how we communicate that to the courts, it'll be a change in process where they would basically have to contact us and see if there was a spot available before they just ordered someone over, because we can't have too many people in there.
Yeah. Okay. Questions for Dan? Okay. Well, Dan, thank you for your report. Stay well.
Thank you all as
Good to
well.
hear from you. I think we're up to Brian Robeson, coming back to Department of Emergency Response.
Brian had another meeting to get to, so you've got me.
Okay, welcome, Jessica.
I think the only other
Could you
thing,
turn your volume up a little bit?
sorry, I have to move the microphone closer. Is that better?
That's much better, yes.
Okay. I think the only thing left that we had was our Tomstat report, which I believe is in the agenda packet. And the only thing we really wanted, we're getting back to pre-COVID-19 call volume. We're back, once they started the phased reopening, the call volumes kind of jumped back to normal, which was to be expected. The biggest one, I think, and I know you guys have asked before about domestic violence and domestic disturbance calls. It's about half, a little more than halfway down on the first column there. The 5-year average would be a call number of 86 for the month of May, and we're at 96 this month. You know, during the whole lockdown, we were at about 120 calls per month. So we're coming down from that, but we're still up over the 5-year average. So.
Okay. All right. Questions or comments for Department of Emergency Response? Okay. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Okay. The Sheriff's Office. Welcome, Sheriff.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me okay now. I got to get a little closer, so I apologize for the
yes
out of my face. Anyhow, just a couple things I'll add. We've talked a lot about things already, but it came up at the last meeting about the motion that was filed by an inmate to get out of jail. That was dismissed. I'll leave it at that. So that was positive news. We've been working with to get some of our state-ready inmates ready to go. We were notified that the state would start taking inmates again as of June 15th. They haven't taken any of ours because they've now laid out a plan that we have to comply with before they'll entertain taking anybody. So we've been working with Frank to get the inmates tested, which is one of the requirements. Once that happens, we have to isolate them, and then arrangements will hopefully be made for them to pick up some of our inmates and get them out of our local jail. Secondly, we've also been working with the Commission of Corrections to start up our visitation with inmates again. GTL did stop funding inmate phone calls for free. We've picked up the slack with our commissary funds and have been covering that. Facilities was kind enough to come up and build us some partitions and stuff in our visitation room to make it safer. Interestingly, all they had to be approved by the commission, even though in the beginning they never told us we could stop visitation, never provided any guidance. Now we have to get approval for them to start it over again. They also scolded us for setting up the barricades because we didn't ask their permission first, but we'll get through all that stuff. And lastly, I'll just add, Anna kind of touched on it. If you hadn't had a chance, you can check out our website. We were able to get almost all our policies on the website for public view. We are the only sheriff's office in New York State that has done that. And so we're quite proud of that. We also have created a commendation / complaint form for the public to fill out that's completely online. There's also an online form for recommending a policy. People can do that. We are going to work with IT to make the site a little more user-friendly. So that's in the works. It is a little funky looking right now when you look at it, but we're getting there. Yeah, use of force is all on there, everything. So take a look at it if you can and let us know what you think.
Yeah, thank you for the work in doing that. That's a good step.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how many state-ready inmates are there?
I'm being told today there's 5. I thought it was a little more than that earlier, but now I'm being told it's 5. I'm not sure exactly why, but that's where we're at. So I think we're at 36 today, and once the 5 will be gone, that'll put us in much better shape.
Yeah, it does seem like the numbers are going up a little bit.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of why that's happening?
No, I think we've had a few hot calls lately that have resulted in some pretty big arrests. So I think that's probably all it is. But I don't think anything other than that out of the ordinary has occurred.
Okay. Good. Questions or comments for our sheriff from anybody? Quiet group today. Okay. Thank you, Sheriff. Thank you, Undersheriff. Right. And we heard from the district attorney. Anna, you wanted member reports.
I think we got it all in.
Okay. Anybody else who has any other business for the Public Safety Committee? All right, seeing none. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Mike moves, Anna seconds. Anna?
No, don't have any more questions.
No, vote on adjournment.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm like, wait. Roll call. Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Glenn?
Yes.
Henry?
I don't see him here anymore.
Well, I'm going to vote yes. So we've got 4 in favor. So I'm going to say that's enough to adjourn. Thank you, everybody, and stay well. And we'll talk to everybody soon. Hopefully next meeting, maybe we could be in person.
That'd be
So,
lovely.
see ya.
Take care, everyone.